Hi everyone, welcome to another video on Social Science Research Methodologies course. The subject of this presentation is quantitative versus qualitative research. To begin with, as both of the names imply, quantitative research seeks to understand the relationship through the use of numbers, quantifications, and hypothesis tests, etc., while qualitative research, as the name implies, involves understanding a phenomenon using real-world context. In other words, interviews, observations, etc. Let me show you what the main differences and commonalities between these two types of research and further details. Quantitative research is deductive, which means that you start from a theory, a bigger picture, and then you try to test that theory by looking at samples. Experimental, because you will sometimes be introduce an experiment and then measure the outcome and effect of that experiment. And also it's random assignments, meaning the subjects or the objects of your test are randomly selected. And it also has variables involved. In a quantitative research, you will have inclusion of variables in the forms of independent and dependent, where you will be testing those variables and drawing conclusion out of them. And it involves testing hypothesis. Of course, anything that involves testing hypothesis also involves data and variables and numbers. Either that hypothesis involves relationships relationships involving causes or correlations. Also, there are data analysis models which are very tangible and data-based methodologies, while qualitative does not involve working with experiments and numbers and variables and hypothesis tests. Instead, it's very inductive, meaning you work from samples to build a bigger theory, a bigger picture of something. So, for example, in quantitative, if you when you use deductive, when we say you use deductive approach, that means, for example, you start from a bigger theory to say, for example, there is a relationship between poverty and intelligence, and then you test those by looking at the samples. While in qualitative, you actually look at the sample interviews to see if you can if you can build a theory to validate a theory to say that there is a relationship between poverty and intelligence. It's contextual, meaning that the research happens in the context of the research. It's also complex. Again, in quantitative, you are dealing with two variables, independent, or multi variables. For example, five, six, seven of them. But are they enough? Because while you're dealing with the society, especially the social science realm, you're dealing with a multifaceted dimension of a problem. So the problem can be solved by looking at two dimensions of them, meaning two variables of them. Instead, it may require you to look at a variety of different dimensions to understand that problem. Therefore, qualitative approach or methodology is very effective in terms of complexity. That it allows you to study a topic in terms of breaking them down in breaking them down in a way that it can actually reduce from the complexity of the study. And again, it's multifaceted and it's related to the complexity, which I just explained, that there's not one or two or three or four variables. It's multifaceted. Sometimes it could be infinite number of variables involved in a topic of study. And it involves discoveries, just like the quantitative, but it's more towards exploration. You're not discovering new knowledge. You're not discovering or new trends in a study. You're exploring what's already there. There could also be cases where you discover new stuff, but it leans more toward exploration of something that's already there. About the way that the sampling is done with the quantitative, there, depending on what type of sampling you use, there is less risk for research bias, although there is a sampling bias and data integrity type of potential issues involved. But with a qualitative, you're more likely to have more bias, because while in quantitative you gather your sample, and then you imply you apply or you deploy models and tangible scientific models, which are it to a good extent guarded from bias. But qualitative research, you're more prone, you're at higher risk of or bias, because it's mostly the researcher's job to study, to gather the data, to study the data, and to introduce conclusions to the data. So therefore, qualitative method is more at higher risk for bias than quantitative. The type of bias that I've pointed out here, these are many of the many number of biases are um, that are being identified and included in the academia. For example, author effect is when uh, when the participants act a certain way when they know that they're being studied. Or observer bias is the researcher himself, when he or she picks up a bias against or in favor of what he or she studied. So wanted to make sure you understand the bias aspect of it. The next one is that again, quantitative is systematic. It could be experimental. It's scientific, of course, because it involves scientific methodologies. It's descriptive, and it's also methodological. While qualitative is very ground it's grounded. It's involved grounded theories. It's narrative. You're dealing with ethnographies, with people. You're looking at historical researchers. You're interviewing people. So again, in quantitative, you sometimes have cases where you're surprised, like, I found a new discovery, a new relationship, a hidden trend. But with the qualitative, it may also involve finding new trends and discovering new trends, but it's mostly exploring a phenomenon or a social phenomenon that's already out there, and you would like to go and research it, and to study it, to interview it, to see, to explore what the other sides of this phenomenon are. And lastly, the quantitative involves random samples. This data come from random samples, meaning there's no bias in selection of those samples. So each sample in a random sampling methodology, each sample has equal chance of being selected. And while in qualitative, it's the researcher decides which group to interview. So, and also the sample that he or she selects is not random, because he or she plans who to interview, or who to study, or who to conduct a qualitative research on. So it's not random. The qualitative data are not random as opposed to quantitative. And quantitative data could be large samples. Sometimes you could be dealing with hundreds of thousands of samples, while in the qualitative, it's small samples. For example, if you're studying a phenomenon related to poverty, you're looking at probably 20 samples, while if you approach it quantitatively, you're probably looking at thousands of records of samples. And again, the source of data for quantitative or surveys, experimental tests, questionnaires, sample statistics, etc. For the data source for qualitative uh, research or interviews, focus groups, field observation, ethnographies, etc. Um, I hope that I did not miss anything, but just lastly, I would like to mention that be aware that these generalizations that I explained in this video, these are just generalized concepts and methodologies that are explained in the books, and also to some extent applied in the field of research, applied research. But again, these, these are not something that will fit in neatly in all categories. So that means you could be using an approach that could be mix of quantitative and qualitative. So I'm not saying which one is better than the other one. It all depends on the study. It all depends on in the context of your study. It depends on the topic of your study. So therefore, we don't have preference for one over the other one. It all depends on again on the context of what you're studying. So that being said, I hope this video was helpful in understanding this topic. Thank you so much.